Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to APUSH. Today we're going to dive into 2008 and the Obama years. And so there's going to be, of course, a lot of picking and choosing because when we get to contemporary history, it's very difficult to know what's going to have sort of long tail effects that we're going to have to talk about versus what things seemed like a big issue at the time and then sort of fizzled out and vanished. So we're going to make some executive choices here and attempt to talk about what led us into the modern era of political polarization. So here's your basic objectives for today. Let's take a moment and move on. Of course, in 2008, Bush is term limited. The Democrats are going to nominate a young senator from Illinois named Barack Obama. The Republicans are going to go with an old hat, the senator from Arizona, John McCain. Obama, in order to balance out the fact that he is younger and black, is going to go with Joe Biden, an older white man. And McCain is going to make the decision to go with Sarah Palin, the young governor of Alaska, to sort of balance out some of his weaknesses. In the end, Sarah Palin ends up being kind of a millstone around John McCain's neck. She gives a number of interviews in which she kind of collapses and seems to have somewhat of a limited grasp on foreign policy. And there's a lot of contemporary talk about whose fault it is that all of this went down and whether or not the media was fair to Sarah Palin. So if you're interested in that, dive into it. But for a lot of people, Sarah Palin's seeming lack of qualifications was a real problem for John McCain. And at the same time, Barack Obama presented himself as sort of young, as vital. He was an engaging public speaker. And of course, obviously, he's black. And that was a significant factor for a lot of people in, pushing for something completely different. This led to a lot of moral panic about Obama. There was a whole bunch of coverage of Obama that I think you could argue was not particularly fair. There was the whole Barack Obama is a secret Muslim thing. And McCain addressed this head on the campaign trail, famously rebuking a supporter who tried to claim that Obama was a Muslim and that he couldn't be trusted. And so this became an issue for a lot of people, but it's not one that McCain really jumped on. And so here's McCain countering the Obama is an Arab question. So if you've never seen this, you should definitely take a moment, dive in, and watch it, and then we'll move on. In the end, it wasn't a particularly close election. Obama made some pretty significant inroads into the South, winning, of course, Virginia, North Carolina, and Florida, as well as the West Coast and Midwest states. The Democrats had traditionally won, and of course, sort of keeping the traditional Democratic strongholds, as we said. And so Obama coasted to a relatively easy victory in 2008. This led to, in general, the victory of Obama led to increasing polarization. We talked previously about the end of the fairness doctrine under Reagan, but it's really during the Obama years that we saw a separation between the business making side of news versus the news side, what's often called church and state. The separation of the financial pieces of a media network versus the ideological and sort of reporting pieces of it. And so in the end, we saw a lot of people creating a lot of moral panic about Obama. For example, that, Obama was a fascist and was the second coming of Adolf Hitler and was trying to usher in an era of totalitarian dictatorship to the United States. In retrospect, a lot of that seems overblown and that rhetoric seems pretty unfortunate. And you can see here we're seeing significant polarization between the two political parties, with Democrats and Republicans really losing trust for each other during the Obama years and really stopping to talk to each other. We get the beginning of people creating their own media bubbles and newspapers and media networks catering to this by feeding people stories and opinions that they want to hear. Take a moment and read, and let's move on. This, of course, leads to especially news sites like MSNBC and Fox News further polarizing, with MSNBC and sites like that praising the president, pretty much universally, and Fox News coming up with stuff like this. Obama's election also kicked off the whole birther conspiracy thing, the idea that Obama could not be president because he was not born in the United States. The first couple of years of Obama's term were marred by continuous demands for Obama's birth certificate. At first, Obama tried to sort of laugh this stuff off and not engage with it. Eventually, he did give both his birth certificate and his long-form birth certificate, but that really has not stopped the birther conspiracy people who believe that the birth certificates are faked. And so the takeaway from this, I guess, is that once we start entering into this world of conspiracy, no amount of evidence is going to disprove any of these things. And so we get a whole group of Americans that believe a series of things that are by definition unprovable. And any information that comes to light just becomes further evidence that the conspiracy is more involved than anyone had any knowledge of before. We're again also seeing, pretty significant polarization of news sites, with Fox News veering significantly to the left, and MSNBC and other stories Fox News veering significantly to the right, and other news networks veering to the left. And so this separation and polarization of news coverage puts people in silos and gets them to stop hearing any sort of contrary opinions. We also see massive corporate bailouts during the Great Recession. This alienates a lot of people because it seems as if the very companies whose irresponsible behavior got us into this economic crisis are now getting a substantial amount of the money. In defense of these bailouts, these companies were absolutely essential to a lot of the way that Americans did business, especially in the mortgage industry, and their failure probably would have created a much larger economic crisis than actually happened. But for a lot of people, there's a massive sort of visceral negative reaction to irresponsible corporations getting bailouts to save them when real Americans are suffering because of high interest rates and high rates of unemployment. And so this didn't sit well with a lot of people, especially as the unemployment rate stayed relatively high. And for a number of years, the financial sector was more or less on lockdown, leading people with degrees in finance, business, and economics to be underemployed in a variety of different industries, as I sort of touched on last time. This is increased, of course, by the increasing amounts of technology, allowing even high-skill jobs to be offshored and outsourced. And so because of this, even some tech and information jobs that previously would have had to be done in the United States can now be done remotely overseas. And so now that the deindustrialization is hitting white-collar workers, leads to significant pushback, especially from college graduates, some of whom have taken on large amounts of debt to get their college degrees and now can't get a job. And during this same period, we're seeing the growth of wealthy people expanding pretty substantially. This leads to a lot of resentment, and I think that's at the heart of the Occupy Wall Street movement. This was a movement in the early 2010s in order to have people go out and, quote, occupy Wall Street in order to demand reform of the finance sector, different differing changes to the tax code. And honestly, it wasn't totally clear what they wanted. There was a lot of marching around and a lot of trying to shut down Wall Street. But in the end, as far as concrete demands go, we didn't really see any. And the Occupy Wall Street movement petered out, although it did get folded into the general growth of progressiveness within the Obama years, with greater fights for economic equality and justice becoming really central pieces to this. The signature law from the Obama administration, of course, is the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. Obama took on healthcare and was able to pass one of the more sweeping healthcare laws in the modern age. It's also one of the most misunderstood laws, so I'm going to briefly go through some of the components of it. Obviously, any piece of legislation is really, really complex, so we're just going to lay it out here and talk about the various components. So, the Affordable Care Act basically has three different components. One is expanding access to healthcare. This was done through subsidies for people who couldn't afford healthcare and marketplaces where people could go buy healthcare. So, access to healthcare was expanded by allowing low-income people to get healthcare through subsidies, and a marketplace allowing people to buy healthcare separate from their jobs. The goal was to also expand Medicare and Medicaid, Medicare and Medicaid to more low-income people in order to sort of close the gap and make sure more people have coverage. The basic argument here is that if you cut down on the number of uninsured people, then those people, when they get injured, will have health insurance, and hospitals, which have to treat them anyway, would then get reimbursed for treating them, as opposed to having to treat them for free and then try to recoup or pull money out of people who don't really have money. Secondarily, there were new protections for pre-existing conditions, for preventative care, for stuff like that. And so these established a minimum standard of healthcare in order to get rid of plans that didn't adequately cover people. And so that was another component. And then at the same time, the goal was to try to lower prescription costs and 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 stop insurance companies from denying people who have pre-existing conditions, which was a problem in that you have a health insurance plan, then when you go to the doctor, something is not covered because the health insurance plan didn't have to cover you for specific conditions that people had, and so it basically allowed people to use their health care more readily. And so those are the three components: greater access to healthcare, minimum standards for healthcare, and protection from pre existing conditions and things like that. So that's the Affordable Care Act. It greatly expanded access to healthcare, and the pushback against this was pretty substantial. Specifically, one very misleading statement that Obama made when selling it. He famously said, if you like your doctor, you can keep your doctor, which in the end was not true. Because, of course, some plans went away because they didn't meet the minimum standard. Some doctors left the profession because of some of the requirements put upon them. And so, obviously, making universal, overarching statements like that is not true. And this was used by a lot of people who opposed the Affordable Care Act to lampoon Obama from here on out. In the end, the downside of the Affordable Care Act is it was pretty expensive, significantly adding to the deficit. There were some problems with the rollout because, in the end, the website healthcare.gov failed for the first several days because of increased traffic. And there were glitches with the website even beyond that. And the raising of the deficit happened because there were supposed to be pieces to pay for it, but because of a lack of bipartisan support, the Obama administration was not able to secure those sources of funding, and so it did increase the deficit. There's also significant opposition from it from a whole bunch of uninformed reasons. The most famous was the whole death panel piece, where Sarah Palin famously argued that Obamacare created these things called death panels that people would have to go in front of to advocate for their care, which was 100% not true, but kept really resonated with a lot of people and was used as part of the argument against Obamacare and socialized and increased healthcare coverage. So the pushback against these Obama policies led to the creation of the Tea Party. The Tea Party is an acronym for Taxed Enough Already, and it galvanized a whole group of Republican voters who previously had been much more disengaged with the process. The Tea Party's basic principle was to limit the growth of government, limit government expenditures, and get the government out of people's lives. And this became an important part of the Republican caucus moving forward in opposition to Obama, and it's going to lead to Republicans taking back Congress and really being able to stymie and block Obama from passing much legislation in the latter years of his term. In the election of 2012, Obama is going to be elected again. The Republicans are going to nominate Mitt Romney, who's really going to struggle to connect with Republican voters for a couple different reasons. As a Mormon, Mitt Romney didn't really feel comfortable or chose not to talk about his faith too much with the fear that he would alienate evangelicals. He also really struggled to attack Obamacare because he had passed a very similar law in Massachusetts that more or less several years before Obama, when he was governor of Massachusetts, he passed a very similar law that did some of the similar things. And so he came off as somewhat hypocritical for running against Obamacare. And he was caught on a hot mic saying this at one point, which made him, as an incredibly wealthy man, seem very out of touch with the day-to-day issues of your average American who was really struggling to get by during the whole Great Recession. In the end, Obama's reelected by a relatively comfortable margin and is going to get another 4 years in office. Obama's second 4 years are marred by a whole series of different issues. For foreign policy, Obama is really going to struggle in the Middle East. In Iraq, a group called ISIS is going to take over large swaths of territory in the vacuum left by the Saddam regime. And this is going to really worry a lot of Americans about the rise of global terrorism. There's also going to be a movement for democracy in the Middle East called the Arab Spring, where you see pro-democracy protesters using social media to topple governments. Unfortunately, the governments that emerge out of this are very unstable, and this is also going to lead to instability and global terrorism. And Obama is going to engage with Iran to pass a nuclear deal, which is very, very, very controversial. The nuclear deal, the goal was to increase inspections and prevent Iran from getting a nuclear bomb. For critics, it was not harsh enough, and it allowed Iran to keep some of its nuclear infrastructure, and it gave them increased funding and release from sanctions, which then could be used to support Iran's various misdeeds around the world. So the Iranian nuclear deal, very, very controversial, and in the end, it was scrapped, and our relationship with Iran is still very, very problematic. We see increasing polarization during this time period. Investigations into the Obama administration increase from House Republicans, and we see a lack of voting together from both sides. There's very little bipartisan legislation that happens, and strict party line votes become almost the norm in Congress, as do long performative filibusters, which don't really accomplish anything beyond allowing different people a platform to show how dedicated they are to opposing Obama. We also see a series of government shutdowns where lack of agreement about budgets leads to the government shutting down and not being able to provide a lot of its services. These shutdowns generally were a disaster for the Republicans who pushed them, leading to backlash and increasing Democratic gains in Congress. But for a lot of Republicans, they were a way to attempt to hold the Obama administration accountable, and government shutdowns are probably going to continue as fighting over budgets and priorities and a lack of compromise continues to dominate in Washington. We also see a rise in partisan gerrymandering and the creation of safe districts. Both parties draw districts in order to advantage their candidates when they control the legislature. The redistricting process happens every 10 years, and the party in charge of every state legislature every 10 years generally draws districts to favor their side, creating these safe seats, which are going to either stay Democratic or Republican. They're going to elect increasingly polarized candidates who now have no incentive at all to compromise because they are appealing just to their very hardcore partisan base and not to a broad array of supporters who might be all across the political spectrum. So partisan gerrymandering becomes a thing that is widespread and has been accepted by both state and the U.S. Supreme Court, leading to increasing polarization. Here you can see a variety of different districts that are drawn in order to preference one side or another. It's kind of a disaster. So let's keep moving forward. The Supreme Court declares the Defense of Marriage Act unconstitutional, which leads to the acceptance and the legalization of gay marriage all across the country. This, for a while, becomes somewhat of a partisan issue, and issues about religious freedom, for example, how involved do private citizens who own businesses have to be in things that they disagree with. There was an example of a cake baker in Colorado who was asked to provide a wedding cake for a gay marriage, who refused. And so there's a series of questions as to where free exercise versus establishment is in regards to gay marriage, but gay marriage is now legal all across the United States. Edward Snowden is an NSA contractor who during the Obama years reveals that the NSA has been broadly surveilling Americans, which freaks us out a little bit, but not enough to actually do anything about it. For a while, the idea that the NSA could tap into people's communications and devices, basically with unlimited authority, really freaked out some Americans. But in general, this has become kind of a fringe issue as people care about more kitchen table issues and mostly allow the NSA to do whatever they want. Last, we see the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. The high-profile death of a number of unarmed black men in police custody leads a whole group of people to organize to start protesting for change. In the end, this leads to some calls for police reform, and you get this Black Lives Matter platform, which hopefully looks somewhat familiar because there's some key similarities to the things being pushed by the Black Panthers in the 1970s to the Black Lives Matter movement today. In the end, there has been limited political movement on the whole police reform thing, although in local areas we are seeing greater actions being taken in order to try to address some of the problems that Black Lives Matter protesters have brought up. And this is going to get increasingly polarized after 2016. So we'll leave it there for now, and next time we'll talk about 2016 to today and try to predict what some of the issues that are going to be important going forward are. So we'll leave you there. Thank you for listening.